So hi everyone and good morning. My name is Mengia and I'm a research fellow at the University of Bristol. And I warmly welcome you all to this virtual symposium on COVID-19 and Queer Asylum. This symposium is organized in close collaboration with the Magnus Hirschfeld Stiftung, the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism, SOGICA at University of Sussex, the Refugee Council of Hessen, the Lesbian and Gay Association in Germany, Rainbow Refugees, and the Council of Europe. To leave as much time as possible to our fantastic panelists, I'll keep my remarks today brief. First, my deep gratitude goes to Nina Held, Anbit Zaman, Daniel Čubelic, Harpreet Cholia, Knut Wächterstein, Lilith Raza, Magdalena Müssig, Mohamed Dalla, and Luna Lara Liboni. They have all worked tirelessly over the last few weeks to make this event possible. Thank you. I would also like to thank our panelists who have so generously agreed to join this conversation today and share their expertise with us. This COVID-19 and Queer Asylum Symposium takes place in lieu of the originally planned conference under the European Asylum Rainbow, which was postponed until September. I am grateful that my co-organizers of this conference immediately jumped on board when the idea of this symposium came up. Their dedication throughout this process has been remarkable, to say the least. When Germany started to go on lockdown in mid-March, it was not surprising that the lives of many LGBTI asylum seekers and refugees came to a full halt, if not crash. Indeed, national calls for social distancing and to stay home reveal the fragility of vulnerable groups which do not have a safe space and the support they need to go through such crises. LGBTI persons seeking asylum often experience loneliness and abuse in reception and accommodation camps. The pandemic tends to exacerbate such social isolation. Being stuck in inadequate living conditions, especially in shared bedrooms, where one cannot be alone, feel secure, and deal with trauma is extremely challenging, to say the least. In this respect, COVID-19 reveals the structural inequalities affecting the lives of LGBTI persons when waiting for their asylum decision. Today, we will discuss these and other challenges while also thinking about what we can learn from such pandemic and how we could use these lessons to strengthen asylum practice, policies, and laws. You'll have the opportunity to join us for four different conversations, starting with a panel on the European perspective on COVID-19 and queer asylum. The second panel engages with questions around asylum and trauma, and the third panel examines COVID-19 related health implications. We will close today's symposium with a legal information session that discusses the implications such pandemic could have on LGBT asylum practice and policy. Thank you for being here and joining us for these exciting and important conversations. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Luna Liboni from the Sex Orientation and Gender Identity Unit at the Council of Europe. She will moderate this first panel of the symposium today. Thank you, Luna.
Thank you very much, Mengia, and good morning, everyone. First of all, before starting with the first panel, I would like to just share some housekeeping rules. The panel today will feature a discussion of about 40-45 minutes, and we will then move on to a 15-minute Q&A in the second part. You will be able to submit questions anonymously via the Zoom webinar's chat function throughout the webinar. Please be aware that due to the high number of attendees, we might unfortunately not be able to answer all questions. And also please note that we won't be able to answer any case-specific questions you might have, as we unfortunately can't offer support to individual cases. However, if you need advice regarding your case, please visit the Queer European Asylum website, where you can find some useful links. Please note that Queer European Asylum is on Twitter with the name of Queer Euro Asylum, and you can tweet about the symposium using the hashtag COVID-19 Queer Asylum. This symposium is also live streamed on the Queer European Asylum Facebook page. So I would like to say hello also to everyone that is following the symposium on the Facebook page. And finally, I'd just like to mention that each panel throughout the day of the symposium has its own Zoom link, which you can find in the message that has been sent to you when you registered. So starting with our panel, I actually have the pleasure to open the symposium as the moderator of the first panel, which is meant to give a European perspective on COVID-19 and queer asylum. Just a brief introduction about me as a moderator. I'm project manager at the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Unit at the Council of Europe. The SOGI unit has been working on issues related to sexual orientation and gender identity in the 47 member states since 2014, providing support to member states to implement European standards and case law of the European Court of Human Rights. Why are we here today? And why are we talking about LGBTIQ asylum seekers? Why, most importantly, are we starting with a European perspective? Well, among those asylum seekers who arrive in Europe every year, several of them have left their country fleeing persecution due to sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and or sex characteristics. We do not know what is the precise number of LGBTIQ asylum seekers, considering that data of this kind is very difficult to find. However, what we do know, and we will see at the beginning of this panel, is that when they arrive in Europe, several LGBTI asylum seekers face specific difficulties that are often very similar in different countries, despite the existence of a set of existing European standards. What we also know is that we are all facing an exceptional situation due to COVID-19. I really hope that all of you that are following this panel are well and safe. This is my first thought. However, we know that the current global coronavirus pandemic has impacted everyone, but not everyone has been impacted in the same way. And it is true also for LGBTIQ asylum seekers in Europe. So we will understand today how the pandemic and the responses adopted so far have affected LGBTIQ asylum seekers in 3 European countries: UK, Germany, and Italy. So I'm quite happy to introduce you to the fantastic panelists that will be with me today. We're very happy to have the interventions of 4 experts from academia and the civil society that have first-hand experience. So I'm very happy to introduce you to Professor Nuno Ferreira. Nuno is Professor of Law at the University of Sussex and the coordinator of the SOGICA project. I'm very happy to introduce you to Jonathan Mastellari from Italy. Jonathan has been supporting queer asylum seekers in Italy since 2012 and is the co-founder of the organization I Am Intersectionalities and More. Leila Zadeh, Executive Director of the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, UK LGIG, and Anbir Zaman, LGBTQI human rights defender, currently living in Germany, that will bring the German perspective. And part of the executive board of, and please apologize for the pronunciation, Aktionsbündnis gegen Homophobie. So I would definitely start with having a conversation with Nuno, Professor Nuno Ferreira. Nuno, as I mentioned in my brief introduction, we do know that claiming asylum based on SOGI-related persecution has been raising different specific issues around the world and in Europe for decades. I would like to understand a little bit with you which are these issues and how have European states addressed the issues so far? This also in light of the findings of these projects. So please.
Well, thank you so much to Luna and to everyone who is organizing this conference. It's a really important event to have precisely at this moment in time, and to understand how we can do more for everyone claiming international protection and suffering a lot from the current virus pandemic. So, as you said, Luna, queer asylum claimants have for many years now been able to claim asylum in Europe. That took a few decades. It only started in the 80s in the Netherlands and then slowly spread around the world. But now it's clear that across all European Union member states, people from sexual and gender minorities can claim international protection. That all started because there is an element in the Refugee Convention that sexual and gender minorities can fit into, which is the particular social group notion. And that's wonderful, that offered that legal avenue for sexual and gender minorities to claim asylum in Europe, and that's a positive development. But there are still many challenges that sexual and gender minorities suffer in Europe when trying to claim international protection. For example, exactly how much persecution do they need to prove, and what is persecution? Do they need to prove that they have actually been in prison? Have they already suffered persecution in their home countries? Or is it enough that they would run the risk of suffering persecution when they go back? Especially there's a big debate around the idea of whether criminalization of same-sex acts is persecution in itself or not. And in most countries, the mere existence of this legislation is not enough to constitute persecution. So even those people who come from countries where there is legislation that penalizes their identities and their behavior, that's not enough. They need to prove that that legislation is actually leading to imprisonment and fines and so on. So that's a big debate, and that's a big challenge that it still faces sexual and gender minority asylum claimants in Europe. Then there's the whole debate about credibility, whether asylum authorities in Europe find these asylum claimants credible or not. And there are many studies that indicate that asylum authorities tend to be very skeptical, and they have what is called a culture of disbelief. They tend not to believe these claimants for a range of reasons, and try to poke holes in the stories of these claimants, very often in inappropriate ways, and using stereotypes, which is very damaging for legal certainty and for the reputation of those legal systems. So there's also a big fight that we need to still have to get against the use of stereotypes and the culture of disbelief in asylum authorities across Europe. A third big challenge that we are still facing nowadays is the fact that many asylum systems still use a sort of idea of discretion, that claimants can be sent back to their countries of origin and somehow hide their sexual orientation or hide their gender identity and simply be discreet. And although very blunt forms of discretion have been precluded by most asylum authorities, in some countries there are still forms of discretion reasoning or discretion requirements going on. So we still need to fight that as well. A fourth challenge that I think it's important to point out is that some countries also believe that these claimants can be sent back and find another place in their countries of origin where they can be safe, which is usually called the internal relocation alternative. And asylum authorities very often fail to notice that there is no safe place for these claimants in their home countries. So it's inappropriate to look for an internal relocation alternative. And finally, a challenge that I think we should also point out is the means of evidence and the means of proof. Exactly what means of evidence can these claimants use? And the European Union has played an interesting role here. It has, especially through the Court of Justice of the European Union, there's been a crackdown on the types of evidence that asylum authorities expect and accept in these cases. So now it's clear that some means of evidence like sex videotapes and so on are not accepted, but it's still very much unknown what evidence is actually the type of evidence that asylum authorities want and consider enough. It's still very much in discussion what actually can convince asylum authorities, because the goalposts seem to be shifting constantly. So this brings us to the European Union, and the European Union has played an important role in all of these. It has supported the inclusion of sexual and gender minority asylum claims in its legislation and in its asylum policy. So European Union directives in the field of asylum have included sexual and gender minorities in its notions and articles. So it's clear that sexual and gender minorities can claim asylum in all European Union member states now. The Court of Justice has also played an important role trying to clarify those rules, trying to protect the rights of sexual and gender minorities. But even in relation to the decisions of the Court of Justice, it's clear that there is room for improvement. Some decisions have been positive, but others could have gone a bit further in making sure that sexual and gender minority asylum claimants could see their asylum claims better vindicated across Europe. So there's still a lot of scope for improvement, both in terms of the legislation that exists and in terms of the decisions of the Court of Justice. But at a more practical level, the European Union also have some rules on reception conditions, on exactly what these claimants can benefit from when they arrive to European territory, the type of accommodation they receive, the health services they are entitled to, access to the labor market, and so on. And again, in relation to those things, what exists, it's insufficient. There should be greater protection of the rights of these claimants to have access to health services, the labor market, better accommodation conditions, and so on. And even if we move beyond what exists on paper and is actually what happens in practice, and as we're going to see in later panels, the European Union has been too slow in the context of this virus pandemic. The European Commission especially could have been much faster in trying to support member states and coordinate their action and making sure that they were ready to support all asylum claimants and refugees. And also, they could have also dedicated better attention to what happens to different groups of asylum claimants, and queer refugees and queer asylum claimants have been very much absent in all these debates so far. So it's a shame that the European Union hasn't been a bit more on the case and proactive, and done a better job in coordinating the action of member states, and expressed greater solidarity towards member states, and also greater solidarity towards the conditions that many asylum claimants, including queer refugees and queer asylum claimants, are undergoing so far. So this is my quick answer to your question, just to kick off the discussion and give an overview of my thoughts so far.
Thank you very much, Nuno. I have a very quick question. Listening to you, you mentioned several times the European Union, and the existence of standards. So why are there different practices? Are there common standards and different practices? Why so? Can you
Yes.
maybe brief us a
So
little bit?
basically, what happens in the field of asylum across the European Union is that at the European Union level there are only what are called directives, and directives is a type of legal instrument that only establishes minimum standards. And so member states are free to deviate from those minimum standards, provided they respect those minimum standards. They can beyond, or they can stick to the minimum standards. So directives, European Union directives, give member states a lot of freedom in terms of how they implement those goals, and whether they want to stick to those minimum goals or whether they want to go beyond those. And that's why there is still so many differences across Europe in terms of asylum policy, because different member states have implemented directives in different ways. Also relates to queer asylum seekers and queer refugees in particular. Some countries have adopted much more generous approaches to the way they interpret the European Union asylum directives, and others have been a lot more restrictive and have stuck to the minimum that is required by those directives. And so that's why there are still so many differences. And even if in the future the standards become much more uniform, which might happen if the European Union adopts what are called regulations instead of directives in the field of asylum. So even if in the future we have regulations instead of directives, I think there will always be differences across the European Union member states, because different authorities in different countries always apply those norms in different ways, and the local conditions are always different. The administration procedures are different, the resources in each country are different. So no matter how much how uniform the legislation is, there will always be differences in practice across Europe.
Can we maybe cite a couple of practical examples of differences, if you have them right in mind?
Yes, well, I think a very striking one, which I always thought is the most interesting in relation to queer asylum, is the fact that the Court of Justice of the European that criminalization of same, so it gives room for asylum authorities in each member state to look into how that criminal legislation is applied in practice. But a particular country, in this case Italy, the Supreme Court in Italy has said that actually the criminalization of same-sex conduct is persecution in itself. And so the Italian courts went beyond what the European Union interpretation of the legislation is. And so it's a clear different interpretation, which so far is still compatible with EU law in the sense that we are talking about directives. So directives give more freedom to different member states to interpret that legislation in different ways, provided they achieve the aims and the minimum standards. But if in the future those directives become regulations, then it will become more difficult for cases like these of Italy adopting a more generous or a more beneficial standard to take place. So that's only one example, and there are many other of the extent of health services or the extent of access to the labor market, policy in terms of access to the labor market. It also adopts more negative policies in terms of detention, and we know there are many queer asylum claimants in detention in the UK. So different member states tend to adopt different standards, and that, of course, can benefit some claimants if they are in a certain country, but will be negative for other claimants in other countries.
Absolutely. No, interesting and important that you also mentioned two countries, the UK and Italy. We have civil society representatives, because we will see later on in the panel that actually what you said counts a lot as a starting point. Different European countries have different starting points. So the way that the COVID-19 has impacted the lives of LGBTIQ asylum seekers pretty much varies on the starting point of and how the countries have applied so far. If they are, of course, EU countries, directives and regulations, and if not, how they're actually handling the situation. So just to contextualize a little bit what you've said, because I know that you're a coordinator of the SOGICA project, and I know that right now we have a lot of participants from all around the world. And I know that SOGICA has a very good resource tool. So I don't know if you can give us a little bit of a guidance in case we might need some resources of this kind.
Yes, definitely. So although we are effectively an academic project, we always meant this academic project to be of benefit to NGOs and claimants and refugees in Europe and beyond, if possible. So if you go onto our website, it's called www.sogica.org. You can find a database. So in that database, you'll find all sorts of materials related to queer asylum, including court decisions, legislation, literature, NGO reports, and so on. And then there's another page with useful links. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to offer advice and support directly, but in that page with useful links, there are links for NGOs around the world that can offer direct support. So if anyone needs any particular information, they can use our database, and if they want to have access to direct support, they can look for an organization in a country where they can have access to that organization in our useful links page.
And the project has a specific geographical scope. Did you focus more on certain European countries?
Yeah, so basically we have concentrated on 3 country case studies, which are the countries that are also of interest today in this event. So it's the UK, Germany, and Italy. And then we also studied the European Union context and the Council of Europe context. So it's effectively a European project. And all our publications and materials are mostly focusing on the European context. Most of our publications are open access, so you can look at our publications page and have access to them. If anything is not open access, please feel free to contact us and we can send it by email. And there will be more output soon. Our book will be out in a few months, and that will be open access for sure. And there will be other publications as well. So there's lots on our publications list that concentrates on different aspects of queer asylum in different countries. And we hope to push it even more over the next few months.
Thanks a lot, Nuno.
Thanks, Luna.
That your intervention gave us a very solid basis to proceed with the rest of our panel. And actually, as you mentioned, the SOGICA projects focus on the 3 countries on which we will focus today, which is the UK, Germany, and Italy. So I absolutely invite you into the conversation, in the following conversation with the 3 other panelists, to jump in whenever you see similarities or you have comments on the ongoing situation. So the rest of the panel, what we will do is to understand what has been so far the impact of the pandemic in the UK, Italy, and Germany, with a specific focus on LGBTI refugees and asylum seekers. These keeping in mind, of course, that LGBTIQ plus refugees and asylum seekers are usually face a double stigma as refugees and asylum seekers, so as having a migration path, and as LGBTIQ persons. So I would like to pass the floor to my panelists in understanding how and if the measures taken so far have been adequate to respond to the crisis. And I will start by addressing this question to Leila Zadeh, which is again the executive director of the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, UK LGIG. Leila, I pass you the floor, and if you can give us a very brief introduction also of what was the work of UK LGIG before the pandemic and how it changed since the coronavirus situation started.
Thank you, Luna, and also Nuno and Mengia for the comments and the introduction so far. So the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group has been supporting LGBTQI+ people through the asylum system, well, the asylum and immigration system since 1993. And we have, since the lockdown in the UK started, we have moved a lot of our services online. So we used to run support groups, for example, and people would meet in person in our offices, but we are now supporting these people through social media instead, through apps, through mobile phone apps, and also we are providing a lot more one-to-one support. So we have found that the people in the support group still communicate with one another, but in terms of what they want from us as an organization, the focus has shifted from wanting us to facilitate the groups and bring them together to actually reaching out to speak to us one-to-one. We have a legal advice service as well, and we are now providing legal advice by phone and email, which we always did, but we are no longer able to provide that service face-to-face, unfortunately. But what we have found is that actually the number of people calling us about making an asylum claim has fallen, but not a lot. So even though movement is severely restricted, we still do have a significant number of people who we give advice to on how to make an asylum claim. We are also still giving a lot of emotional support to people who are held in immigration detention centers. So these are people who cannot leave the building that the government has put them in. These detention centers are built like prisons. The need for emotional support for people in these centers has increased. And the final aspect of our service I will touch on, or our work that I will touch on, is our policy and advocacy work. So since our very early days, we have campaigned for changes in the way the system treats LGBTQI+ people. And our focus has really shifted in these last few weeks into how the government is responding to COVID-19. That's just a brief overview. Our work is much broader than that, but that's, those are a few main things that I would like to pick out for you. So in terms of changes that the government has made, thanks to advocacy by different NGOs, so we have been part of this, but we've also worked a lot with other agencies in the UK. I would say the government has made 4 changes which are worth sharing with you today that are to the benefit of people. So if your asylum claim has been refused by the government, by the Home Office, and also your appeal was refused, you can fresh claim. So basically you submit a new claim with new evidence. And it used to be the case that everybody had to do this in person in Liverpool, which is very difficult because people in this situation normally don't have any income. And so they would have to travel across the whole of the country to go to this one city to submit this claim. And the government has now allowed people to do it online. So this is an improvement, but you do also wonder why they couldn't have done this in the first place. Secondly, normally if you're granted refugee status, you have to move out of your accommodation that the government gives you within 28 days, and people would be evicted at that point. The government has now put a pause on those evictions. So that is something we are pleased to have seen, that nobody is going to be forced out of the house at that point. because this is not the climate in which you can expect somebody to find their own accommodation and move themselves from one property to the other. 28 days was never long enough anyway. So it's really a positive move that the government has done this. Similarly, because of the delays in now people moving from the support system provided by the government to accessing mainstream benefits, so in terms of welfare support, the government has now said that they will continue to give people asylum support, which is less than £40 a week or less than 44 euros a week. They will continue that payment until people can access mainstream support. And importantly, they've said that they will not allow anybody in the country to be homeless. They will try to make sure that everybody is accommodated, which is really good news because, like many countries, there is a lot of people who are sleeping rough. However, there are still a number of problems that the government hasn't addressed. One effect of not evicting people from the properties, if they're granted refugee status or if their asylum claim has been refused, and the fact that they have said they don't want people sleeping on the streets and that everybody should be given a home, is that they need to increase the accommodation. There isn't enough in the government contracts right now for everybody who needs it. So they're looking for new properties, new places where they can house people. We do not know what kinds of places or properties these will be, but also it could be in areas that have not previously received people who are seeking asylum. And the likelihood, we suspect, is that these will be in areas that are not close to major towns or cities. And LGBTQI+ people who are seeking asylum are very often quite isolated. And many people who are LGBTQI+, even if they're seeking asylum, their preference is to access an LGBTQI+ specific service, or at least link in with an LGBTQI+ community. So with the government looking for new areas in which to house people, there's a risk that LGBTQI+ people who find themselves in this new accommodation will suffer increased levels of isolation. Now, this accommodation is what happens to people at the later stage of the asylum process. When they first make a claim, when they first make their claim for asylum, if they need accommodation at that very point, they're put in initial accommodation. And that's quite often large units. So for example, a hotel housing a lot of people until they can later be moved out into a shared house or a shared apartment somewhere else in the country. These places are very overcrowded at the moment. The government has told everybody in UK that we should be trying to keep ourselves 2 meters away from everybody who is not part of our own households. But that's pretty much impossible to do if you're living in a hotel with other people. The rooms in these hotels are often shared. Often people have to share rooms in shared houses and apartments as well. But we're now hearing that even in the hotels, people are being asked to share beds. Now, people will, I'm sure, be familiar with stories of LGBTQI+ people who have been harassed or abused by other people in their accommodation. So the thought that somebody may now even actually have to share a bed with somebody is really, really problematic and very concerning. Nuno mentioned in his intervention earlier about the fact that the UK makes a lot of use of immigration detention. The government is still holding people in detention centres. They have released about 300 people, but we suspect there's still hundreds more held behind bars in Britain. In the current global climate, there is very little chance that the government can remove these people from the country and oblige them to go elsewhere. But they're not releasing them from detention either. And there was an expert report which found that 60% of people in detention centres could contract coronavirus. And bearing in mind, once again, that LGBTQI+ people are at risk of violence and harassment inside detention centres as well, where they are completely deprived of their liberty. Now, I mentioned earlier that people who need financial support from the government are entitled to less than £40 a week or 44 euros a week. The government is refusing to increase that at the moment, whereas for citizens or residents in Britain who can access mainstream support, they increase the welfare benefit by £20 a week. They're refusing to increase that for people seeking asylum. And the costs for people seeking asylum are much higher at the moment because they can't access free Wi-Fi like they used to, because we're not allowed to leave our homes unless it's absolutely essential, and the places providing free Wi-Fi are often now closed. We have been told to minimize the number of times we go shopping. But in order to do that, you need to buy more, and it's hard to buy more on each shopping trip if your income is limited to less than £40 a week. And the government published something on the website yesterday, a fact sheet that said that actually there is no need for this cohort to call on any funding outside asylum support, which I think is extremely naive, I think, is at best to make a statement like that. And as I mentioned before, LGBTQI+ people are at heightened risk of isolation, so access to phone credit, to internet is really important to help people stay connected at this time. The final point I'll make is that the government is maintaining a system of sharing data between the department, between our National Health Service and the Home Office for immigration enforcement purposes. This puts a lot of people off from accessing health services at the best of times, and they're refusing to change this at this time when we are in a global pandemic. Also, the government does charge for some health services. If you're seeking asylum, then you are exempt from health charges. You should be able to access them for free. And in fact, testing for COVID-19 or treatment for COVID-19 specifically is free for everybody. But ultimately, it's a very confusing message for people, and there's a really big deterrent effect on people seeking access to health services. Get on top of additional fears that LGBTQI+ people have. For example, we have clients who are afraid of being completely open with their doctors because they're afraid that the doctor will inform other people that they are, for example, a lesbian woman or a gay man.
Leila, thank you so much for this very comprehensive overview of the challenges. I have the feeling that we will see some commonalities when we will talk about the experience of Italy and Germany. So what I would suggest is to have a conversation with Ambit now and see if there are some overlappings in the challenges. And of course, as I said to Nuno earlier, please feel free to jump in whenever the conversation is similar or is different, is touching similar or different points with regard to the UK. But again, thank you so much for this overview. Ambit, thank you for being here. Ambit Zaman, as I mentioned before, LGBTQI human rights defender, currently living in Cologne. I will address the same question to you. How has the coronavirus situation impacted LGBTQI asylum seekers and refugees in Germany so far? Have there been measures taken? What was the impact? So I leave you the floor. Ambit, I will just ask you to unmute yourself. Thank you so much.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Luna. As you said, the situation in Germany is actually very similar to what LGBTI refugees applying for asylum in Germany, that the government is failing to shield them from the coronavirus, as infections at one crowded reception center has risen sharply in recent days. If you look into the city Ellwangen, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, within 5 days, the infection raised from 7 to over 250. So the problem is here that we have refugee centers where people are living very close to each other. There are about 1.5 million refugees in Germany. Many live in centers with several hundred inhabitants. Conditions are cramped, and in some cases, residents share dormitories with strangers. LGBTI refugee rights organizations have already long criticized the conditions and privacy people. But at the moment, the fact that people have to share bathrooms and kitchens is actually exacerbating the situation and making LGBTI people more vulnerable, not just to the infections of coronavirus, but also more verbal abuse or torture. It's very worrisome as well that refugees were being locked without any warning. And from my personal experience of exile, I can tell that this time being in isolation, or at least I'm able to go out and go do shopping and also live with people I like, not strangers in the apartment, but somehow it can also trigger so much in a traumatized person if all of a sudden you realize that you cannot leave your apartment or you cannot leave your shelter and you're stuck with all these people that you are not sure that if they are infected. There are visits of doctors in refugee centers sometimes, but and regularly, but somehow it's not really enough, because then the LGBT individuals are not able to talk to the doctors openly about their issues, as Leila pointed out as well. And the situation right now in Germany is more like the refugee centers are so crowded that it feels like a cruise ship with infected people. There are reports that there are infected people within the refugee centers where somehow the government is failing to isolate these individuals properly or offering a separate unit. There are still some plans to open a center where people who have been infected or in contact with someone infected can be housed in separate units, reported from Berlin Health Department. And when these bans happen in refugee centers, somehow the information or explanation is not sufficient. And not just enough to put up multilingual posters about coronavirus. People who do not speak German are struggling to find answers to questions about how easy it is to get infected and which activities are still allowed in public. And this is causing a lot of trouble and confusion. Also having to share the same canteen, kitchen and bathrooms. Talking to people with who live in a total isolation in a refugee camp, which is far away from the city, and have had struggles to get in touch with the community to vent their suppressed emotion, and not having to still hide themselves in fear of homophobia or transphobia in refugee camps. People are really struggling with this pandemic more than what many of us are doing. There are also the LGBT organization who has been supporting in terms of providing a social environment or a community where they could express themselves freely or practice freedom or feel comfortable is not possible anymore. Not just because of these refugee camps are far away from the city centers or LGBTI community centers. It's also because of the lockdown, which happened very suddenly. The experience of sexual and physical violence and torture also seem to resurface as a result of this crisis. And as offices normally tend to support refugees' needs and also listen to their queries are now closed. Many LGBTI people who are in refugee camps don't no longer have a venue where they can report abuse or seek additional help. Also, I think it's important to mention that this whole crisis can also interrupt many trans refugees' hormone treatments or getting enough health support from the health practitioners. The coronavirus also threatens the basic survival of many LGBTI refugees in Germany in terms of not having, for instance, when you are coming as an LGBTI refugee in Germany, you come without your family. You don't come together with your family and friends who you fled together. Somehow you are away from your family and probably not have a very good relationship. So then you rely on your friends and these organizations who support you. And somehow there are support available. There are initiatives in terms of self-care or providing online counseling, but it is not enough. It is also important to mention that in the response to COVID-19, I think Germany should do more because it has more capacity and resources than many other European countries. And it's important to recognize that LGBTI refugees are special in a way that we're more vulnerable and also more in danger. And we have been doing social distancing from the time we have realized that we are LGBT individuals and we were not accepted in our communities, for which we had to leave our country. And these vulnerable groups, to protect these vulnerable groups in the time of pandemic, I think it's important to recognize them as equal as citizens of the country, and also to put safeguarding mechanisms in place. Not everyone has a safe home where they can cope with this crisis with the help of their loved ones or community they have built around. Authorities need to take urgent action to ensure LGBTQI refugees to have continued access to health services such as hormone treatments and psychological support, which is very important. That I'm very fortunate that I could still continue with my therapies that I'm sure is not accessible to many of the individuals who are living in refugee camps. And also it's important that in this time of pandemic where everything is kind of stopped, the processes somehow still go on. And on the way where we had organizations who support legal counseling in order to minimize the extreme isolation, it's the extreme hostile situation for these individuals to go through their cases, asylum cases. I think it's important to find out mechanisms how we can still continue that and not put LGBTI refugees at the risk of re-traumatization.
Thank you so much, Anbit, also for sharing your personal story and for giving this very extremely important insight. I have a few follow-up questions regarding the situation in Germany, but I'll pass now the floor to Jonathan to see if there are some common paths, some commonalities, and see also if the participants have questions with regard to the intervention. My questions here. Jonathan Mastellari, thank you for being here, co-founder of I Am Intersectionalities and More. Italy has been mentioned several times. Italy has been one of the countries that has been first impacted by the pandemic. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what's the situation for LGBTIQ plus asylum seekers and refugees, and which are the actual struggles in the country and the measures taken?
Yeah, thank you, Luna. Hi, everyone. Yeah, the situation in Italy is, for some aspects, is very similar to Germany and UK, actually. LGBTI and queer migrants have been stopped and blocked at home due to the lockdown. But the situation actually is different from the north and from the south Italy. In the north, as you know, we have a strong COVID pandemic. In the south is something lighter. But the Italian law has actually has adopted for all the national territory. So even people in the south, they have some problem to have access to hospital and health services. In our opinion, actually, I work with LGBTI and queer migrants since 2012, previously with another organization, and last year we created a new organization called I Am, where we work with intersectionality topics, and queer migrants is one of the services that we provide. Actually, one of the biggest problems that we experienced during these days of lockdown, we saw problem with trans community, as someone has already mentioned it, due to the problem to receive hormones from the health system to go actually to the hospital. Some offices in the hospital are closed during lockdown. They are open only for emergency. But the other problem is violence at home. Some trans asylum seekers that we work with, they live privately. They are not in a camp, but live privately with their partner. And some of them, they got very, very violent during this period. But the problem is, for example, that they cannot have access to the center for violence against women. There is no national law in Italy that explain we should be the good practices for this kind of center to accept trans people, for example. And during lockdown, it's very, very difficult, for example, to move from one city to another city. There is no very strong situation. I think this situation is very important, very strong. It's a very important motivation to move from a place to another place. But one of the problems of this kind of center is that actually we can open another point that in Italy now is very, very good to test for COVID test. And this is another problem for LGBTI and queer asylum seekers, actually for all the migrants and asylum seekers that live in refugee camps, because they have to live all together as UK or in Germany. And so, for example, Center for Violence Against Women, they don't accept new people inside their place without any test. So this is, for us, this is a very strong problem at the moment. Another problem in Italy, for example, is to have access to HIV drugs. There are many organizations that are trying to provide a solution for this problem. For example, Plus in Italy, that thanks to that, Plus is an organization based in Bologna as our organization, and in our city, a local network has been created. The name of the network is Don't Panic, to provide services and to provide solutions for the local population that have some problem to have access to food, to some services during lockdown. And in this network, in this local network, we created a specific path for and specific is not a helpline, but specific support for LGBTI community of our city, of our provinces. And this organization, for example, provide HIV drugs, and they bring this kind of drugs to all the houses where HIV positive people live, even place where LGBTI asylum seekers live, some camps. So this is very, very important. another very important point, I don't know in the other countries, but in, for example, all procedures for migrants and asylum seekers has been stopped. So it means that there is no way to renew permesso di soggiorno or to meet the commission. Previously, the time to meet a commission was very, very long. Before Salvini decree, it took something like 1 year and 2-3 months. After Salvini decree, the time was just a bit shorter, but now with the lockdown, the time is getting very, very longer. Okay, the point about permesso di soggiorno is quite important because actually the government postponed the deadline of all permesso di soggiorno, but there is no really clear guideline about how to take some appointment to renew permesso di soggiorno when deadline expired. I mean, there is a national website called Coupa. You can find it if you want to do some research or if you want to try to understand how it works. The name is Coupa Project, but not all the police, I mean, in Italy is Questura, but not all the national police services that work with migrant staff adopt this kind of system. So it's not clear how to take a new appointment to renew permesso di soggiorno and how to start again all the procedures to stay here in Italy. Of course, one of the most problems for asylum seekers, Lgbtqi, asylum seekers and queer asylum seekers, to stay at home with other people that we can suppose that they can be homophobic or transphobic or biphobic, we don't know. And they have to live all day, 24 hours per day in that place. Actually, I'm one of the person that think that we should keep the lockdown going. So I think that we still have high numbers in Italy. But of course, this is a very big problem because you cannot live your life in a free way. And in Italy, we have just some few projects, some few camps or flat dedicated to LGBTI asylum seekers.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Actually, I just want to notice with you that there are some parallels. There are some strong parallels between the three countries. We've seen that LGBTIQ asylum seekers and refugees are currently being impacted by the coronavirus situation, as all of us, but the issue is that they are also facing the same issues, the same problems that they were facing before the beginning of the COVID-19. And that's why we talk about specific issues of LGBTIQ in the specific circumstance. And that's why I think it's so important to draw the attention on this and to have a conversation around this. I actually would like to start to refer to the questions that we are receiving by the attendees. The first question is for Jonathan, actually. One of the participants is asking if the shelters for victims of domestic violence are not accessible without COVID-19 test results. Is this the case?
Many shelters that we contact, they answer to us this. But this is a common problem to have access to many services now. They want to be sure that our experience, I mean, I don't want to say that all the shelters in Italy work like this, but many shelters that we contact, they told us that it's not possible at the moment to have a sex without any COVID test. that is not easy to receive. Actually, I know personally because I'm positive to the COVID test, so I know that is a very long path before to receive this. So it means that people before to enter in the center, it takes a long time, so it's not easy. I didn't read and I tried to find, but actually if someone of you knows better than me and has any more information about that, please send it to me, send it to our organization about a common policy for this point. Italian government and Italian institutions work a lot about violence against women overall in this period. So it's very important, but there is this small but big problem to have access to shelter. That is a strong problem, is a very big problem for even for trans people. There is no, I repeat, there is no, we didn't find, and I asked to many other LGBTI activists, there is no national guideline or good practices about access for trans people M2F in this kind of center.
Okay, thank you very much for the clarification. I'll also like to comment that if I understand correctly, the situation varies from place to place within the country itself. So of course, right now we are having a country-specific approach, but we've seen also before that there has not been quite a consistency in the practices of the states when referring to the specific vulnerabilities of LGBTIQ+ asylum seekers, even before the COVID-19. This just to refer to this. I actually am happy to bring back Nuno in the conversation because we have a question for you that is actually linked to a decision of the European Court of Justice that you mentioned. Has there been any attempt to challenge the decision that has been done that has been taken by the court? Can you debrief us a little bit on this?
Yeah, so I guess the decision that we're talking about, the decision in X, Y, and Z in the Court of Justice of the European Union. And as far as I know, there's not been any subsequent case at the Court of Justice of the European Union trying to change that interpretation of the Court of Justice. It did come as a bit of a surprise because it does contradict the guidance of the UNHCR. So the guidance of the UNHCR suggests that criminalization of sex conduct is very close to not prosecution. So it was a bit surprising that the Court of Justice was so reluctant to follow that line. It is true that another avenue could be the European Court of Human Rights, and we could think of this as a violation of Article 8 on the right to privacy and family life and so on. But the problem is that the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg would not be more favorable either, because the European Court of Human Rights applies a much higher threshold for violation of the European Convention norms when it comes to migrants and asylum claimants. So the European Court of Human Rights gives member states much more freedom in terms of what they can do in terms of asylum policy and migration policy. So they wouldn't find that there is a violation of Article 8 or Article 10 either, if the European country were to send the asylum claimant back to a home country where there is criminalization of that criminalization also constitutes a systematic violation of Article 3, which is the prohibition of torture. So unfortunately, it means that there probably wouldn't be any chances of success at the European Court of Human Rights either. So far, the only country that we know of where criminalization of same-sex conduct constitutes persecution is Italy. really. I'm not aware of any other jurisdiction or any attempt to challenge that at the Court of Justice of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Nuno. Just for the sake of clarity for all the participants, can we just spend a couple of words on underlining the difference between the European Court of Justice and the European Court for Human Rights?
Sure. So basically, the Court of Justice of the European Union, it's a court that exists within the structure of the European Union. So it is only there to interpret and apply European Union law, which only applies to 27 member states now Union. So it only has to do with those 27 member states, which are mostly in Western, Central, and a bit of Eastern Europe. The Council of Europe, it's much broader. And so the European Court of Human Rights exists within the context of the Council of Europe. And the European Court of Human Rights is only responsible for interpreting the European Convention on Human Rights, which is much narrower than EU in general. Plus, it applies to many more countries. So it does not only apply to 27 member states, it applies to the 47 or 48 member states of the Council of Europe. You can remind me how many countries
47,
there are.
47.
47, yeah. So it has a much broader geographical scope, but it has a much narrower substantive scope. It only interprets the European Convention on Human Rights. So some cases can end up both in the Court of the EU and in the European Court of Human Rights. So the facts of the case may have to do with both the European Convention on Human Rights and EU law. Other cases can only go to one of the two courts because of the facts in the case.
Thank you so much. I actually have a last question that it's quite a big question that I think will lead us to passing the mic to the next panel. That is, how can human rights lawyers and civil society help LGBTIQ refugees in the current crisis? I understand that it's a huge question. We could have a whole separate panel, and that's why this is only the first panel of the day, actually. But if you can maybe bring your perspective on this before we wrap it up, it would be fantastic. I don't know who wants to intervene on this. Maybe either because then with Ambit we will have a German perspective throughout the rest of the day.
Maybe I can say something. I think that, of course, LGBTI activists and human rights activists has to talk about that, about the LGBTI situation generally, not only when we have pride, or specifically in this period we should inform people about this kind of situation. It's not easy for everyone to and provide services far away with a social distance, but we should stay in contact with our with the people that we work with. Just another word, I read something about sex workers. Of course, this is a point. We should, one of the point is, for example, to put sex worker that in this, we have a lot of problems to have access to welfare, to any kind of services because they don't work, but actually we should inform them, we should give them specific information where to go to receive some welfare helps or something like that. And this is something that we can do. We can still do. We should inform. We should create a network, not only locally, but internationally. As for example, there is a very strong network, SOJESC, that is an international network where me and Luna and Nuno, we are inside that network, and it's very important that we share good practices between us, I think.
Thank you so much. We actually came to the end of this first panel. However, I would just like to mention that as we had foreseen at the beginning, we couldn't answer to all the questions. However, what I tried to do was to focus a little bit more on the European perspective, also on the questions, so that the rest of the questions that were mostly focused on Germany will be addressed in the rest of the panels, because as said before, this is only the first panel of the day. So we are right on time. It's 11:15. We are done with this panel, and I would actually like to thank you all. We had a high number of attendees, and I would actually pass the floor virtually to the next moderator. The next moderator will be Daniel Čubelić from the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism. And the second floor that will start, the second panel that will start in 15 minutes, in around 15 minutes, will focus on isolation and trauma. So again, thank you all, and see you in the next panel as an attendee.